Hi, my name is Dave Reske, CEO of Now Speed Marketing, and welcome to this edition of Marketing in the Now, where we talk about the best ideas of marketing and digital marketing. And my guest today is Becky Chandler. Becky is the former Vice President and General Manager of Bright Horizons, where she led the creation of a new B2C digital marketing business. She was also the GM and head of e-commerce at Armstrong World Industries. Becky, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dave.
I really enjoyed our conversations. We've been talking about a really challenging subject that I think our listeners will be very interested in, and that is transforming tech-enabled businesses that are behind the competition and the change management processes to get you there. And I think it's a particularly interesting topic because we think of tech-enabled businesses as always being at the leading edge. And it's fun to focus on the ones that are out front, the ones that are the biggest brands, the ones that are like all well known. But there's a lot of companies that are not the leader in the market, but want to be the leader in the market and have to, they're behind and need to transform themselves in order to get there. And you've had a lot of experience in this area. So I'm excited about talking to you about this subject. So first of all, just introduce the challenge to us. What is the challenge of kind of being in a tech-enabled business that is behind the competition and needs to
Sure.
transform themselves to get in front?
Yeah, I think in a lot of organizations, sometimes you might have family-owned businesses or executive teams who maybe aren't as digitally savvy, and so you've built up some tech debt over the years. A lot of times also there's sort of complacency, like, oh, it's fine, we're doing okay, kick the can down the road. We don't want to make the big investment. Sorry, that's my dog. Um,
Totally okay.
and you find yourself in this situation at some point where you have to invest. And most folks will get that eventually, but it takes a lot of energy to kind of put together the case for the investment required, and also educating and evangelizing people across the company. You have to really repeat yourself several times before people start to kind of get on board, because a lot of times you're trying to get multiple stakeholders on the same page for that investment. So that's something I have seen is just, times went by and sort of executives teams not maybe making the investments that they needed along the way, and then it's caught up with them.
Yeah, and so they're in that situation. But these companies that, and we're generalizing, of course, but these companies, when they launched and grew and attained some level of success, they were innovators at one time. They were successful. They had a legacy of that. And then, in your experience, what happens to companies when they maybe grow on some platform, they've been very successful,
Yep.
but then they plateau and they don't continue to innovate. What is
Yeah.
happening internally or externally in the market that causes?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I've seen is the market's just gotten more competitive. In one company I worked for, they were a leader in the space. They had an edge. They had somewhat of a captive market due to the nature of their business, and over time that shifted. Less retail foot traffic, more traffic going online. They still had a bit of an edge, but they really needed to modernize. So I think that's a lot of what I've seen is innovation is happening faster than some of them are innovating themselves. And yes, they might put effort into looking at some new technologies or having a hackathon, but you really have to be able to implement that and also, change manage the organization. So that's where things can fall down. I've led business transformations, for many e-commerce and omni-channel retail companies, but I also have led a lot of the sort of enabling infrastructure transformations, so everything from analytics to marketing technology. And it's kind of the same thing in the sense that, it's all the same skills required to sort of change manage and, go to market successfully in those cases.
Yeah, interesting. Although the stakes are probably higher with business transformation than a technology transformation, right? Because you're trying to get the business to another place or deal with competition. Although
Yes, no.
maybe
Although
no.
now we've
No?
shifted the narrative. So, yes, there is technology transformation, but we're always putting it in terms of the business now, where
Mm.
where I've seen it become more challenging is when it's truly like enabling infrastructure that makes things work, like the piping between systems, but is not directly related necessarily to any one line of business or their P&L. And that some of that infrastructure and transformation is the most critical because it's very foundational to a business being able to operate.
Yeah, so if you have to do the foundational transformation well, and that's just as critical. Well, let's
Yeah.
talk about the steps in the process because I think that that business transformation is difficult. And so I imagine that one of the first steps is ideation. Like, what do we transform here? We had a business, our businesses was working and we were growing just fine. But now we sense some unease, some challenge, some competitive issues. So what is that first step of kind of getting to a point of transforming the business? Is it,
Yeah.
understanding the problem? Is it understanding the competition? Is it figuring out what the team is? Like, where do you begin?
Yeah. Where I've really started is kind of with the company's annual operating plan or company strategic plan. Most companies have them. Sometimes they don't, but it really helps to set the stage for like where we're trying to get to, whether it's public or privately held. Usually starting with those kind of goals and milestones in mind will help the organization kind of rally around it. So I think that's the first step is I always try to look at where is the executive team? Do we have a strong finance organization? Do we have executives aligned to sort of where the organization needs to go? If they're not aligned, obviously that's a different problem, but assuming they are, that's a really good place to start. And then kind of from there, understanding what is the current thinking around what the biggest opportunities are for the business. And we like to think about, there might be something that's really transformative, but it takes a lot of effort and it has a little more risk. And we like to balance that with other initiatives that will help us meet some of our goals, but maybe are easier to implement, easier to roll out across the organization. So always trying to have we call them, I guess, pebbles and rocks and boulders, like having a mix of investments that have different sort of time frames, different risk profiles, different ROIs, so that you can make sure you're delivering all along the way. Because those large transformative investments may not pay off for 2, 3, or 4 or more years.
Yeah, so you got to have a variety of things. I love that. Let's start with that first one. I think that, and then that's a very, very wise advice. It feels like business transformation needs to start from a place of strength. It's easier, I guess, when you start from a place of strength. So that initial analysis that you're doing about the team, the business, where we're at today, if you're coming from a place where you've got a good, solid business, you've got profits, you've got cash flow, you've got a strong team, people know what they're doing, you're operating well, it's easier to jump into something new,
Hmm.
into a better place, right?
Yeah.
Rather than from a position of weakness. And then the second piece is that is what you talked about ideation and think about the biggest opportunities. And maybe you could just kind of help think about the process of, or talk about the process of prioritizing the pebbles, rocks, and boulders that you talked about. Because I think it's
Yeah.
also another piece of wise advice, whereas you don't want to just say, oh, we've got challenges, so let's do this one thing. And this one thing is going to make all the difference and take us to a whole new level. And everything's going to be better if we get this one thing right. What you're saying is think about a whole series of things and you'll see change in different areas, right?
Yeah. Yeah, a good example of that is last year for Bright Horizons. I helped lead our entire strategic planning process, and it was the first time we had brought kind of the enterprise product teams together with all the different product and tech teams, marketing teams across the different lines of business. It was quite time consuming, but I think it was a really good exercise, got everybody on the same page. So we, did some activities all in a big group where we could jointly prioritize and allow groups to review other groups' outputs. And then some where teams went off on their own and kind of came up with their wish list, so to speak. So went through several iterations of that, but it was really important that we do that because, again, those enterprise investments that are needed across all the business, we needed to get everybody on board with that. We used kind of a loose rice scoring methodology for that, where we talked about kind of the impact in terms of like reach, like how wide does this go? Um, Impact, of course, rice. Confidence, so how confident are we in that outcome? What risks do we have? And then effort. So we sort of calculate, how impactful something is, but then divided by the efforts so that, initiatives, like I said, that are maybe not as big of a financial return, but they're easy to execute, get put into the mix because we can actually get those done while we're working on the bigger recs.
And then I would imagine that you prioritize those and then make choices or decisions about that. And maybe in some organizations, that decision process is made by maybe by the CEO, by committees, by department heads, depends on the level of investment, right?
Yeah, I mean the VP level and the director level are doing the hard work and they're bringing those recommendations up, and then your chief digital officers and your SVPs and executive vice presidents are typically making a final call. But by the time it gets to them, the big priorities are really known, and so people tend to be pretty aligned when you're that far down the path.
So you've got some initiatives. You've got a sense of what the investments are going to be. You understand the impact, and I love the rice model that you shared. Now talk to me about the change management process because this seems like the hardest part. You've got something that's big, and maybe it's you've made the investment, maybe it's successful, but now you've got to implement that change, and that could be a change in how you go to market. It could be an organizational change. It could be a product investment. It could be a probably change it. And a little bit my bias, I read a book many years ago called The Innovator's Dilemma, which helped me think about change management and innovation in different industries. And I think it's a very difficult thing to do to make this organizational transformation. It's one thing to do with one of your small pebbles. Yeah, we can make that fix. But if you're going to make organizational change, that can be difficult. So talk to me about the change management process when you've got to make big organizational changes and how you make that happen.
Yeah. That's a good one. So one of the biggest issues I've seen in my career is that folks tend to think of these large initiatives as technology projects. So, they get, someone from the business or they get a IT project manager and, you know, that team will bring it to market. And it's like that's a somewhat of a fallacy because success is obviously getting those business outcomes, and a key part to remember is that, the people in the lines of business, the marketing function, the tech function, the operations function, I mean, they need to be users of that tool system, processes, whatever it might be. So getting the training and adoption is pretty critical. So that's one thing is that um it's less about the technology and it's more about like the people in the process. So I like to think of it in terms of people, process, and technology. We often take care of the technology part, but where it falls down is people and process. So I think it's another important thing is making sure that executive leaders are on the same page and are also jointly accountable and their teams are jointly accountable for outcomes. And this goes back to like goal setting in organizations. So there's a lot of frustrations folks have, I know, with goal setting because you're often dependent on other teams. But I guess if I were in charge of a super large initiative at this point and it were my team, I would be making sure that I was partnering with, my head of technology or other executives, and that we would together decide what those key success indicators are, and then the team would be jointly accountable for those. That almost never happens, unfortunately, and from what I've seen, it usually is falling on a couple of teams who are doing the hard work to kind of bring it to life, but then it falls down in kind of the adoption phase. Um, Training is a big thing too. I have always been a big proponent of making sure people feel comfortable and are testing and learning and using the systems and tools. I like to always think about a post-launch phase where folks aren't on the hook for like the big returns right away, but they're starting the systems, they're using them, they're getting trained on them. I mean, you can't get the outcomes unless folks are actually trained and using those systems. And it's also important, businesses have often many, many, many tools doing the same thing, or there's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of tech debt. And so I always like to make sure that there are, resources available for whatever new functionalities are coming to light because we often, I found in previous experiences, would have a plethora of tools, but there was often no one to use them, so they didn't get adopted. So those are a few of the big things, I think, making sure executives really understand what it means and that initiatives are not just technology projects, but it takes a lot more kind of buy-in from the people on the ground who are doing the work. You know, these are your managers, your associates, your directors even,
Yeah.
who are going to be the power users of different systems.
So you've got to get buy-in from people on the ground, right? The users of the systems, and you got to set up the systems and process and make sure the training's all there. But let's talk about the executive leaders a little bit. Maybe I'll just throw out a scenario. Let's say you have you're talking to a VP of sales, and she's responsible for revenue attainment for the organization, and you've launched a new tech product that's going to, be good for the organization, but maybe she doesn't really believe in it. And she has a choice. She can say to the senior team, well, do you want me to sell the new product or do you want me to make the revenue goal? You choose. And let's say she puts that out there and you believe that the innovation is critical to the success of the company. How does the CEO or the organization handle that challenge of aligning the organization's goals with maybe one leader's goals?
Yeah, I guess for things like this, one thing that works really well or pretty well in my experience is before you get to the stage where you're making these big investments, you've kind of pilot tested, you've kind of done some experimentation. You could, for example, one of her concerns might be you're going to take my top salespeople off of X, Y, and Z, put them on this new product. It's like maybe she has a point, and maybe there's a way to organize the resources so that we're using maybe a more junior resource, or we're maybe not using the top performing salespeople. We're using some of the up and comers to pilot test that. So thinking about who's doing the work, the resources that you're using to do that. Um, I always have what I call a discovery phase too before these large initiatives, before you get that big bucket of funding, kind of going through a stage gate process where you do your experimentation, you do your pilot tests, and then you come back and you ask for, the money you need for that very large investment and transformation. You often don't know upfront when you start, how much something is really going to cost. And then there's not a lot of tolerance to come back to the well and say, well, we forgot this or we forgot that. I mean, there's definitely some of that, but try to avoid coming back to the well and saying that you forgot to anticipate something. So I like to, sell it in over time, make sure that people are kind of walking in lockstep and like seeing the results together. And that way you can kind of avoid some of that when it really comes to a head. Ideally, that's the way to think about it, is try to find some way to demonstrate those results ahead of time before making a big switch in
Yeah.
your resources. And makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you have successful salespeople, pulling them off of a, successful business might not be the right thing, but there's different ways to skin the cat.
Yeah, and I love what you shared there because instead of beating up that executive for not following the corporate line, you're thinking, wait, listen, what's the what's the point? And you've thought through and you shared a few ideas to head that off in advance. Have we done our research? Have we tested this? Did we set up the right experiments? Have we done our homework? Did we
Mhm.
prepare this properly? Did we assess the risk involved in the launch? Did we use the right resource? Maybe it's a junior salespeople. Maybe it's assigning, other people involved. Did we align the risk with the return of this instead of just mandating some corporate edict to make this change happen? You've kind of thought about the details all the way through, and that's super wise. Well, let's take a little bit further. What happens in an organization when you make the investments and you're working on a change and it's not working the way you want it to? Like how do you deal with that part of change management? Because not every bet you're going to make is going to be successful, but you want them to be, right? And these are
Yeah.
super important investments. But what do you do in an organization when it's not working
Yeah.
yet. It may work, it may not work, but
Yeah.
there's always that point where you've launched. I'll give you an example. We just launched a new service at my digital marketing agency. It's on GEO, generative engine optimization. It's like SEO for AI, right? And it's new. It's only a couple months old. So we've got our first few clients. We're kind of doing everything, but it's not transformational yet. So like, how long do you give it? When do you stop? When do you put in more energy? All those things. But anyway, I'll let you answer the question and then
Good
you help
question.
me think
Wow.
about my challenge.
That's thought-provoking. Yeah, so I guess the first principle is like upfront before I enter into anything, we as a team understand risk and then how we're going to mitigate it. So when we see a risk starting to bubble up, we think about proactively like what could we be doing to sort of stop or mitigate this risk? And so trying to put those steps in place along the way. Um, I think you can, again, it's kind of like graduated investment. Like you put a little bit in, you see what you got, you tweak and iterate back and forth. So hopefully you're not getting so far down a path that you have to completely stop. You have to, it's a sunk cost or anything like that. That usually is fairly catastrophic in an organization, if you have a very large sunk cost like that. Um, I think it's important to understand what is the root cause of it not being successful yet. So could be timing, could be, more R&D is needed, could be people aren't buying into it. Like I think it also depends on what we think is causing it not to be as successful is another one. I've often been in organizations too where, if there's an off-the-shelf tool, component partner, service provider that can help us bring something to life, we outsource that and we focus our efforts on where we're uniquely positioned. So that might mean bringing in a different partner, provider, agency, depending on what the product or service is, so that your folks are focused on kind of like the most important parts of that service offering. But that's kind of things that we've done because I've definitely been on very large initiatives that were having significant risks. And we make it a point to, have a steer co for these very large ones where we have the right executives in the room to help make decisions, depending on what the blocker is. Very small companies might not have that, but you might just in a smaller company need a couple of key folks to help kind of make decisions on what mitigations need to be put in place. So that's kind of how I've approached it.
That's really helpful. I think you know, thinking it all the way through is what I hear you say. It's like you got to do the deep work to figure out how to mitigate your risk, how to get around the issues, how to solve problems, get all the people together. They have to want to do it and work together to solve those problems,
Yeah.
rather than bury yourself in excuses or, hope the problem goes away or just wait and hope for the best. It's all those things that you don't want to do. But if you're really managing the
Right.
business well, if you got an issue, you got to deal with it. And it
Yeah.
feels like that's those same kind of principles that help you, initiate. You got to have the organization that's willing to initiate these changes. You got to have an organization that's willing to do the hard work of implementing them. And you got to have an organization that's willing to see it all the way through and deal with the risk. So it's
It
really
is.
leadership is critical to this whole process, right?
It is. The other thing that just came to mind too is just asking for help. Sometimes you need to tell your leader, like, hey, I really need your help doing X, Y, or Z, or convincing this person, or whatever it is. Like, I many times find myself struggling, and I'm like, gosh, I need to be very direct and say, I need your help. This is the challenge. So it's beyond, the communications and the steer codes, but really just saying, hey, could you please do this to help me? It would really help this initiative be successful. So kind of calling that out, something I learned, in the last year or so is just asking for help when you need it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we just have a few minutes left, but I just want to ask you, what do you say to organizations that are just not interested in even tackling the change. They're just like, no, we're okay. We're making enough money. We're fine. We're not really growing. Competition stuff. It's gonna be okay. We'll just ride it out. We don't need that whole this whole change thing sounds really stressful. So stressful, All that we're okay. No, don't need. So, and what do you say to them about like, no, you need to like engage in this process to figure out how to transform yourself to go figure out,
Yeah.
own again.
Well, sometimes folks don't necessarily understand what change management really means. So I always put it in business terms, like what is the risk of not doing anything?
Mhm.
You can be wiped off the map if you just don't respond to, changes in the market. So sometimes, a catalyst is needed. You've got to have a, smart board member or one of the executives kind of starts to flag something. I think for them, they have to be at the right time. They have to be in the right mindset to accept it. Sometimes it's bad timing. Like, they need to see it for themselves. So I like to, talk less about sort of change management and more about, you know, the business and talk in their language, make it very relatable and what's in it for them. Like that's the other big thing. I didn't mention that until now, but in these larger enterprise initiatives, one thing we always made sure of was that we almost never communicated, generalities. We would make it very specific to that line of business, what was in it for them. If they committed the resources to this, what they would get out of it. Because at the end of the day, unfortunately, sometimes that's all that matters. Depends on how businesses have their P&L set up, but our teams were very focused on their own initiatives. So I think those are a few things. Sometimes it takes the right time, the right catalyst for teams to see it. And the right opportunity, frankly. Like, what is the impetus for change?
Yeah, very powerful ideas, Becky. Well, it's been a great conversation. Thank you very much for sharing those with our listeners.
Thank you.
If someone wants to get in touch with you to further cut the conversation or just learn more about how to work with you, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
I'm on LinkedIn. I love networking. I often mentor folks who are earlier in their careers, so feel free to connect with me, especially if you're in e-commerce, digital, product management, or marketing. I love it. I've been in it for 25 years, so feel free to reach out.
Great. Well, thanks again for joining the show today.
Okay. Thanks, David.